Coming up on Security Now with Steve Gibson, I'm Jason Howell. My final week until Leo gets back next week. Steve's going to go deep on TLS Credential Delegation. Also, there's a number of BlueKeep updates that Steve reveals, as well as some good progress on browser support of DOH. And Checkrain is now in beta, so you can check it out for yourself. Steve Gibson breaks all that down next on Security Now.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Security Now with Steve Gibson, episode 740, recorded Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. Credential Delegation. This episode of Security Now is brought to you by Worldwide Technology. Worldwide Technology's Advanced Technology Center is like no other testing and research lab with over 150 different security services and applications, including OEMs like Cisco Umbrella. And it's virtual, so you can access it 24/7. To learn more and get insights into all that it offers, go to wwt.com/twit. And by FreshBooks, the #1 accounting software in the cloud for self-employed professionals and their teams. Make the running of your business simple and efficient with FreshBooks. Try it free for 30 days at freshbooks.com/securitynow. And by Thinkst Canary. Detect attackers on your network with honeypots that can be deployed in minutes. For 10% off and a 60-day money-back guarantee, go to canary.tools/twit and enter the code TWIT in the How Did You Hear About Us box. It's time for Security Now with Steve Gibson. Jason Howell filling in for Leo one last week in a row. Leo gets back in a couple of days, Steve. So next week, you're going to be doing this show with Leo in the other room. How's it going today?
Who?
Yeah, exactly. I know. That's what I'm saying.
Who? What? Oh. So, Leo has delegated the podcast the last 4 weeks to you.
Yes,
and
I've been honored.
Today's topic is credential delegation for Security Now. Number 740 for November 12th. This is interesting. This jumps on to this sort of an extension of one of my own long-running issues with secure connections. All of our longtime listeners know how wound up I have gotten in the past about the failure of TLS, or back then SSL, certificate revocation. So there's a new game that is beginning to emerge. Actually, it's already in Firefox, which is cool. By the end of the podcast, our listeners are going to know how to turn that on and test it in their copies of Firefox. So a lot of stuff happened this week. We're going to check in on the developments of the long-term, now working, full consumer jailbreak of iOS devices from iPhone 4S through iPhone 10. It's in its early beta, but it exists. We're going to examine the strange case of the misbehaving transducer, catch up on the rapidly evolving exploitation of the BlueKeep vulnerability. There's been a lot of news there in the past week. We're going to check out Mozilla's rebuttal to COMCAST's attack on DOH, examine the surprising state of web browser support for DOH. I didn't realize they all have it already. And I just stepped on the lead. Remind Linux and BSD users to refresh their distros after an important flaw was discovered in the widely used archive library, which allows remote code execution. Then we're going to take a deep dive into, as I said at the top, the operation of a newly announced forthcoming solution and standard. It's in the IETF's hands now for significantly improving the state of TLS website certificate security for a subset of all use cases. This doesn't solve it for everybody, but it solves a class of a big problem known as TLS, Credential Delegation. So I think another great podcast for our listeners at 740.
No surprise. 740, you got this down. You finally got it down, Steve.
Figured out how to do this. Yeah.
We were doing the math before the show and going like 2007? Was podcast even a term when this show launched? Like, you've been around a long time with this show, and there's a reason why. You pack in the knowledge. So we are going to dive right into everything Steve set up there. First, let's take a break. We'll thank the sponsor of this episode of Security Now, and that is Worldwide Technology. WWT began building their Advanced Technology Center 10 years ago, and it's grown exponentially ever since. It's like no other testing and research lab. The lab contains more than $500 million in equipment from hundreds of OEMs, ranging from heavyweights like Cisco, NetApp, and VMware to emerging disruptors like Tanium, Equinix, and Expanse. WWT is a trusted partner who stays with you over the years. Many of their customers have been with them for over a decade because they know that WWT is where they can go to get the answers that they need to make sure their business runs right. Their ATC is an incubator for IT innovation. It offers on-demand and schedulable labs like Cisco ACI segmentation migration and hundreds of other labs representing the newest advances in endpoint security architecture, software-defined networking, network automation, primary and secondary storage. And you can learn about products before you launch. WWT's engineers use these environments to quickly spin up proofs of concept and pilots using the sandbox so customers can confidently select the best solutions. And in many cases, this actually reduces concept time from months to weeks, which increases speed to market. They offer Lab as a Service. That's a dedicated lab space within the ATC. Here is where customers can perform programmatic testing using the vast technology ecosystem that WWT has already built. It's virtual, so you can take full advantage of ATC's unique benefits anywhere in the world, 24/7. WWT engineers use and work in these labs every day. They're beta testing new equipment, they're building reference architectures and custom integrations to help their customers make decisions and see results faster and with much less investment. And WWT has launched their new digital platform encompassing the ATC ecosystem. This ecosystem creates a multiplier effect of knowledge, speed, and agility anytime, anywhere around the world for their customers. So they can get access to articles, case studies, hands-on labs, and other tools that make the difference in today's fast-paced world. You can learn more for yourself about WWT, the ATC, and sign up for access to their new on-demand lab platform by going to wwt.com/twit. And you can create an account today while you're there. WWT simplifies the complex. That's wwt.com/twit. WWT is delivering business and technology outcomes around the world, and we thank them for their support of Security Now. All right. Checkmate is official? Like everyone,
Yes.
legit, with a capital L?
Well, not quite everlowercase.
Okay.
I don't know if it's ever going to be legit. If I'm sort of
That's
like
true.
the anti of legit.
Lowercase
But
L.
our picture of the week is a picture of the web page that we showed several weeks ago when we were cautioning our listeners about how to type in the domain name so they didn't go to checkrain.com by mistake and download some badware. But what we're seeing now, our picture of the week, down there is a link. It says, get the beta now.
Nice.
So we have moved into the first, actually it's the first public betas, because I checked again this morning. We have 3 of them so far. There was first version 0.9, then there was 0.9.1, and now we're at 0.9.2. So, and also it's worth noting that the official site is now Checkra, CHECKRA.IN. So that's the way they got the Checkra in the .in top level domain. So that's where they're aiming people. And if you were to go to the original Checkrain, where the I is a numeral 1.com, it just bounces you over to the proper location.
That makes way more sense.
So as we know, this is the public preview of the USB tethering iOS jailbreak, which is based on the unpatchable iOS Checkmate boot ROM exploit, which can never be fixed, which Apple can never go back and fix on all the devices up until they found this last summer. So up to 12 point, I guess up to and including, I think, because I'm confused, because I did see some, when I was digging into this, there was some comment about 12.3.2 and 12.3.3, but maybe I'm misremembering it and it was 12.2. But anyway, it's the devices based on the A5 through the A11 chip, but not the A12 and 13. So and not yet everything. So for example, this 0.9.2 beta explains, it says this release is an early beta preview and as such should not be installed on a primary device. We strongly recommend proceeding with caution. Then under what's new, to give our users a sense for what's going on here, they said fixed an issue where the Apple Watch would not receive notifications while jailbroken. Improve reliability of entering DFU mode. Fixed an issue where Checkrain could not be used on Mac OS 10.10. Oh, it's worth noting that right now it's strictly a Mac-based launch of this. They'll be getting to other stuff to Windows and Linux subsequently. But at the moment, you have to have a Mac in order to do this early beta preview. Then they said this beta adds an option to boot into no substrate mode. To utilize this functionality, hold the volume button up when the Apple logo appears until the device finishes booting. From there, you'll be able to uninstall any tweaks causing you issues and reboot to get back into a normal jailbroken state. Then, and here's the most important part at the moment, unsupported devices. They said Checkrain will eventually support all devices between the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 10. However, this beta lacks support for the following devices: iPad Air 2, iPad 5th Gen, iPad Pro 1st Gen, and then they said support for these devices will be added in a later release. Support for the following devices is experimental and may require more attempts than usual: iPhone 5S, iPad Mini 2, iPad Mini 3, iPad Air. They said reliability on these devices will be improved in future releases. So there are some where they're saying we got it. There are some where they're saying, we almost got it. And then there's some where like, no, don't even try this yet. We'll get you. And they said this beta only is available for Mac OS. Work is ongoing to support Windows and Linux, which will be added in a later release. Anyway, so just an update. This is for the security industry. This is just a windfall. Apple has to keep the more recent of those devices current with all of their new patches and fixes. This means that researchers, both wearing white hats and black hats, will be able to crack into any of these iOS devices which are supported in order to completely, thoroughly reverse engineer what Apple has done. So, this is like the worst thing to happen for Apple's attempt to keep people out of what they've done. We know that security through obscurity is not something you can rely on, but if you can get obscurity in addition to security, why not get it? Because reverse engineering does help bad guys discover problems that have not otherwise been discovered. And this makes iOS, until at some far future point the iPhone 10 goes out of update cycle, it makes it deeply reverse engineerable. So the expectation is this doesn't represent any kind of a security problem for your typical end user, except if someone were to take your phone into the back room, use this to jailbreak it, and then you weren't unaware that had happened, that had happened, it would be a way for border agents entering a hostile country to get deep access into an iOS device if you were unaware. So certainly this says, because this cannot survive a restart, that if you are traveling into a country where you have lost control of your iOS devices, even briefly, it's worth completely powering down and restarting it clean, because what this has done is it has made those devices always jailbreakable with a USB connection to the device in order to make this happen. And it's open. It's going to be widespread. I mean, again, this has been a real hit to Apple's security. Not something they're happy about, but not something they have any control over.
Yeah, that was my follow-up question, is what could they really do in this? They've been pretty good at kind of keeping things like this at bay, but this really just sounds like such a blowing the lid wide open, you know?
Yeah, jailbreaking had been it's the whole concept of secure boot, where the ROM verifies the signature of the kernel before it loads it into RAM. Then it transfers control to the kernel. The kernel verifies the signature of all the other stuff that it's loading piece by piece, and nobody but Apple is able to sign any of this. Well, that's gone now. I mean, so Apple was able to use this secure boot chain to absolutely guarantee to its users, and we like that when we start our phone up, it's, and the stuff that's running in our phone has been signed and has been verified all the way through startup. And then we know that any apps that we are running are having their signatures verified also. That's the part that breaks, which then means that malware can be implanted on our iOS devices by anybody who has access to the device. So Apple doesn't like this. Doesn't like that compromise of their security guarantee that until now they've been able to offer all of their users. Nor do they like the fact that everybody, security researchers, can now easily sift through their code looking for as yet unfixed problems. And we know there are as yet unfixed problems because Apple is constantly fixing problems, which were unknown until they fixed them. So, and in fact, this also means that in the same way that Windows patches are being immediately reverse engineered and turned into relatively short-lived exploits, so too can Apple patches be. When Apple fixes something, since Apple rather lazily rolls out these iOS updates, somebody can get it, figure out what changed, reverse engineer it, find the problems. If it's useful to a bad guy, they can then exploit it until such time as the targets get themselves updated to newer versions of iOS. So, yeah. It was only recently that we got the stronger iOS auto update feature in our iOSs. So there are the older ones still of iOS still covered by working devices may not be updated as quickly as the newer ones. So yeah, it's and here it is. It's gone from Checkmate to now we actually have what we were expecting, which is the first working the first working exploit, which anybody can download. And the guys who are doing this are having a ball. They're going to just because they can, they're going to make it robust and bulletproof and reliable and working on all of the devices within the range. So very cool.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Very, yes. Very, maybe not so cool as it is interesting.
Yeah. I'm really intrigued by this next story as well, because we talked about this a little bit last week on This Week in Google, and I'm curious to get your take on this.
I saw the news also before last week's podcast, and I thought, but upon digging into it more, I thought, okay, this is kind of fun. It's in one of the weirder pieces of research, and I titled this "The Case of the Misbehaving Transducer." In one of the weirder cases of recent research from a researcher with Japan's University of Electrocommunication, there is such a place, and 4 researchers with the University of Michigan, we have their paper titled "Light Commands, Laser-Based Audio Injection Attacks on Voice Controllable Systems." It's like, wait a minute, laser-based audio injection, huh? So, okay, by definition, a transducer is any device that converts energy from one form to another. That's the dictionary definition of a transducer. Typically, it converts a signal in one form of energy to a signal in another, but it doesn't have to. But for example, in the case of a signal, we all know that a speaker is a transducer that converts electrical current into movement of a cone, which then reproduces sound. And going in the opposite direction, a microphone is a transducer that converts incoming sound into movement and then into electricity. An example of a non-signal transducer is a light bulb, which converts electric current into light, and solar panels go in the opposite direction, converting light back into electric current. So transducers, one form of energy into another. And in the past, we have encountered some weird transduction behavior, such as the famous case of shouting at an array of hard drives, which increased their read error rates and reduced their measured data throughput. That way we had fun at that. There was like a YouTube video of some guy who looked like he lost his mind screaming at a RAID array, but sure enough, it upset the hard drives. They were functioning as audio transducers, even though they were certainly never meant to be that. There was another instance where a whole data center crashed because the incredibly loud fire siren whistle thing went off, and hard drives all failed in there because this thing was so loud, and hard drives had become so twitchy about any mechanical perturbation, because their density's gotten so high that they've just, all the engineers have engineered all the margin and engineered out all the margin for error. So now we have another oddball transducer failure. As they describe it in their 17-page paper, they said, quote, "We have identified what they described as a semantic gap between the physics and specifications of MEMS, MEMS, which is the acronym for Micro Electromechanical Systems, microphones, where such microphones unintentionally respond to light as if it were sound. They said, exploiting this effect, we can inject sound into microphones by modulating the amplitude of a laser light." In other words, these microphones are light sensitive as a weird side effect. Who would have thunk? And you got to wonder who even thought of trying this. Let's aim a laser at our Amazon Echo and see what happens. What? So think about this. someone located hundreds of meters away could tell your Amazon or your Google voice assistant to unlock your front door or open your garage door. That's not good.
Yep.
So in their paper's summary abstract, they wrote, "We propose a new class of signal injection attacks on microphones based on the photoacoustic effect, converting light to sound using a microphone. We show how an attacker can inject arbitrary audio signals to the target microphone by aiming an amplitude-modulated light at the microphone's aperture. We then proceed to show how this effect leads to a remote voice command injection attack on voice-controllable systems, examining various products that use Amazon's Echo, Apple's Facebook's Portal, and Google Assistant. We show how to use light to obtain full control over these devices at distances up to 110 meters and from two separate buildings. Next, we show that user authentication on these devices is often lacking or non-existent, allowing the attacker to use light-injected voice commands to unlock the target's smart lock protected front doors, open garage doors, shop on e-commerce websites at the target's expense, or even locate, unlock, and start various vehicles, in their examples, a Tesla and a Ford, that are connected to the target's Google account. Finally, we conclude with possible software and hardware defenses against our attacks." Anyway, I'm not going to go into this in any greater detail since everyone gets the idea here. But if we were to re-express this in more classic security terms, we would say that, to understand why there's this problem, we would say that the lack of authentication that's present in today's voice command systems represents a rational trade-off between convenience and security when used in the typical environment where it's not possible for a random stranger at a distance to inject their own authenticated voice commands into those devices. So this lack of authentication is obviously not normally a problem, but it becomes one when voice commands can be injected at a distance. So this falls into the category of it's unlikely to be a problem even today, really. I mean, it's an interesting attack, but I don't think everyone needs to immediately throw their Google device under a black scarf, although might not be a bad idea.
Or not in front of a window.
Right. Good point. But of course, future devices whose microphones are inadvertently light sensitive might wish to add proactive illumination blocking, since that could presumably be easily done at no cost. And our current crop of voice command devices currently obviously lack that. Mm-hmm. So, it's not something anyone considered. It would be simple to, spray a little black paint on the inside of the cavity where that microphone is located so that it could still have an acoustic input, but would be blocked by light. That could be done for no cost. It's just not something anyone thought of before. So I imagine because it won't cost anything to do it in the next rev, and I mean, the list of devices, I don't think there was one that wasn't attacked by these guys. I mean, there's everyone I'd ever heard of and some I hadn't heard of. Mm-hmm. So, this is, as I said, oddball, but certainly intriguing.
Oddball, but not entirely without at least some form of concern. Like you point out, like being able to give a voice command that unlocks your door, like that's actually a pretty big deal. I suppose
not good.
But then at the same time, like who would really go through the trouble? Like I saw that like the equipment that they used all splayed out onto the floor, and I was just fascinated by what they were able to do to with the transducer and everything to kind of convert the signal and everything. It's going to take a really motivated individual, but maybe that's the case for a lot of security flaws. It's not that it's difficult; it's still possible, and therein lies the flaw. So you got to do something about it.
Well, and of course, if someone really wants to get into someone's house, you just throw a brick through the window.
There's that too. Yeah,
it's not like there's no other way to get into a house other than unlocking the front door. So and you might say, oh well, but what about in a really secure facility? Well, then a really secure facility has no windows.
Yeah,
my level 3 data center where I've got GRC servers. There's no windows. There's not. I mean, it's a bunker.
Yeah.
So
that's very true.
Yeah. So anyway, we have to remember that security is the weakest link, and someone's window is always the weakest link for a break-in. Although the reason it's interesting, the reason we worry about these sorts of attacks over the network is it allows somebody in a foreign country to attack you at distance. This doesn't allow that either. They can't get you from Russia with a laser beam. So
yet.
Yet, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, it's certainly fun to have to look at the consequences, the actual security consequences of a transducer transducing or transducting a form of energy that it wasn't expected to, and how we presume that the transducer is only going to convert what we want, and in this case, not so much.
Yep. So maybe I'll move my Google Home out from the window in my kitchen just to be safe.
Well, you don't want it to be in the heat. I wouldn't I wouldn't want it to be in direct sunlight. That's not good for electronics in general.
I didn't even think about that. So far, so good. It's been there a couple of years now. It's doing okay, but yeah.
So last week's podcast was BlueKeep and DOH, and we've got follow-ups on both of last week's headline topics. Microsoft, their security team believes, with good reason, and we'll get to that in a second, that more destructive BlueKeep attacks are on the horizon. And they are once again, for the third time, urging users and enterprises to apply patches if they've been lagging. I think we all know by now that if anyone was going to update any of those more than 700,000 Windows systems, which are still right now exposing vulnerable RDP protocol that's susceptible to BlueKeep takeover, it would have happened months ago. Those systems would have been updated. Nobody's going to update those systems apparently ever. So I think that these repeated Microsoft warnings must be for political CYA cover rather than for any practical purpose. They want to be able to say, oh, well, we warned everybody multiple times. We told everybody, we even patched old Windows XP. We did everything we possibly could. I mean, this has to be why they're doing this, because they must know that nobody's listening who's in charge of these 700,000 Windows machines, amazing as that is. So, as we covered last week, we're only seeing BlueKeep leveraged to install crypto miners so far. As ZDNet summed things up in their coverage, they said many security researchers considered the attacks underwhelming and not living up to the hype that was built around BlueKeep for the past 6 months. This was because Microsoft said BlueKeep, this is still ZDNet talking, this was because Microsoft said BlueKeep could be used to build wormable, self-spreading malware. However, writes ZDNet, the attacks that happened over the weekend, that's what we talked about last week, did not deploy malware that could spread on its own. Instead, attackers scanned the internet for vulnerable systems and attacked each unpatched system one at a time, deploying a BlueKeep exploit and then the cryptocurrency miner. This was far, they write, from the self-spreading malware outbreak that Microsoft said BlueKeep could trigger. Furthermore, in many cases, the BlueKeep exploit failed to work. Well, we'll get to that later because that's been fixed, crashing systems. But Microsoft says this is just the beginning and that attackers will eventually refine their attacks and that the worst is yet to come. So anyway, Microsoft said last Friday, quote, while there have been no other verified attacks involving ransomware or other types of malware as of this writing, the BlueKeep exploit will likely be used to deliver payloads far more impactful and damaging than coin miners. We cannot discount enhancements that will likely result in more effective attacks. So, okay, Microsoft tells us again that we all need to update. All of us who can and heard this certainly did already. So here's an interesting tidbit. We've been hearing a lot about how the attempted exploitation of BlueKeep has been crashing systems. And recall when we talked about this last week that it was when Kevin Beaumont first noticed the BlueKeep exploitation. He first noticed the BlueKeep exploitation because the servers of his honeypot farm were crashing. Now we know why. At this time, the only public proof of concept exploit for the BlueKeep RDP vulnerability is a module for the Metasploit penetration testing framework. That module was in turn assembled from a proof of concept code which was donated earlier this summer by RiskSense's security researcher Sean Dillon. Sean, who tweets as @0sum0x0. So as we know, although the exploit code works it has had the tendency to crash the systems it's targeting, rather than delivering a remote shell to the attacker, which is what it does when it doesn't crash. And as I just mentioned, it was when 10 of Kevin's 11 RDP honeypots crashed that the world first became alert to this BlueKeep-based campaign. Well, of course, we often quote Bruce Schneier's astute observation that attacks never get worse, they only ever get better. And eventually, recent events with BlueKeep have followed that path. This past weekend, the BlueKeep Metasploit module was fixed to entirely eliminate the source of the BlueKeep blue screen of death BSOD crashes. You're not going to believe what it was that was originally tripping up BlueKeep. It was Microsoft's patch for the meltdown flaws in Intel's processors. Those systems that were never patched for the meltdown flaws did not crash. Those that were patched crashed, and certainly lots of those have been patched. 10 out of Beaumont's 11. Quoting from an interview that Sean Dillon gave over the weekend, he said, "From looking at screenshots of the analysis Marcus Hutchins did," of course we know Marcus as malware tech, "we know code execution was achieved, but that the honeypots were crashing because the exploit did not support kernels with the meltdown patch installed," said Sean. The original exploit that he created incorporated what he called a KVA shadow mitigation bypass. Those with good memory may recall that KVA shadow is the official name, Microsoft's official name for the patch for meltdown. But another researcher pointed out that there was a way to bypass the need for the system call hook that was causing the trouble in the first place. So Sean updated the exploit, which has now been posted to GitHub and incorporated into the updated Metasploit framework, which now changes the way this attack occurs so that a meltdown bypass is no longer needed. This raises the early BlueKeep patch to now a fully weaponized state. It is 100% reliable and no longer triggers BSODs. So I have a link in the show notes for anyone who is interested. There are also a lot of discussion on the various developer forums about this. But so essentially, in the course of 1 week after we saw that this was being used and crashing these kernels, that's been fixed. We now have a 100% reliable, non-BSOD triggering BlueKeep exploit. So if systems were crashing as a result of the implementation of the first exploitation, they will no longer. And Marcus Hutchins, who again, malware tech, the guy who, as we know, famously stopped Wannacry, the Wannacry internet worm in its tracks by registering that bizarre domain name when he noticed from reverse engineering of the worm that it was pinging that DNS, making a query for that DNS. He's weighed in on the issue of a BlueKeep-based worm. He posted the following tweet thread last Friday, which I'm going to share in its entirety since he raises a number of very good points and because he obviously knows what he's talking about. So his first tweet said, when the news broke about BlueKeep exploitation in the wild, most of the reactions were basically, quote, "It's not a worm, so it doesn't matter," unquote. He said, I decided I'd do a thread on why that's wrong and why a worm isn't even a worst case scenario. So he did it. He then generated a thread of tweets which read, there are two main purposes of a worm, and he has in parentheses self-propagation. First, dealing with cases when there are too many vulnerable systems to infect reliably with just scanning alone. And two, dealing with a large disparity between the number of external and internal facing vulnerable systems. He says the Wannacry worm served both these purposes. Firstly, there were just too many vulnerable systems to infect by scanning servers. In other words, yes, it was a target-rich environment. It was too rich. And secondly, he says, if a network had SMB, server message blocks, Windows file sharing, exposed, then the chances that every single device on that internal network was vulnerable were very high. In other words, if the worm got a foothold on an exposed border server, it could pivot to the LAN and scan internally in order to find probably all the internal systems, which was really what made this thing so destructive, is Wannacry penetrated networks. And he says, Marcus says, BlueKeep is different. Not only is the number of externally facing vulnerable machines low enough to infect with a couple of servers, but also RDP is only enabled by default on Windows Server operating systems. Because Windows clients don't expose RDP by default, unlike SMB, a BlueKeep worm wouldn't be able to pivot to systems within a network like Wannacry did. Furthermore, I'd guess it's fairly likely that if one of the network's RDP servers is exposed to the internet, they all are. For all these reasons, a BlueKeep worm would not be hugely effective and not at all like Wannacry. they might infect marginally, not exponentially, more systems. But the downsides are huge. A worm would not only attract a lot of attention, but be technically challenging due to the limitations of BlueKeep. The exploit, and he's writing this on Friday before this got fixed, the exploit is both unstable and non-generic. He says, parens, the attacker would need to somehow fingerprint the OS and exploit accordingly. He says, building a worm in a way that doesn't just repeatedly crash every BlueKeep vulnerable system would be challenging. And of course, we know that's been fixed now. He says, and by no means worth the reward. He says, I'm not really worried about a worm. What I'm worried about is something that could already be happening. Most BlueKeep vulnerable devices are servers. Generally speaking, Windows servers have the ability to control devices on the network. Either their domain admin, have network management tools installed, or share the same local admin credentials with the rest of the network. By compromising a network server, it's almost always extremely easy to use automated tooling to pivot internally. He says, example, have the server drop ransomware to every system on the network. He says the real risk with BlueKeep is not a worm. A worm is pointless and noisy. Once an attacker is on the network, they can do far more damage with standard automated tools than they could ever do with BlueKeep alone. Remember, all those news stories about entire networks being ransomwared. That starts with a single system being hacked. Not even a server, a normal non-admin client system. Attackers don't need worms. It was just convenient in the case of Wannacry/Eternal Blue. People need to stop worrying about worms and start worrying about basic network security. Firewall your servers off from the internet. Maybe he meant intranet. He must have meant intranet. He said internet because, of course, a server on the internet that's firewalled off from the internet can't be attacked externally. He says, learn about credential hygiene. Occasionally, worms happen, but every day there are entire networks compromised using only standard tools.
That's a good point.
So I obviously think he's exactly right.
Yeah.
We know that for since the beginning, I had said I didn't think BlueKeep made sense to use with a worm because, Shodan already knows. It already has a list of all of the available RDP servers, which have already been scanned many times now to find the ones that are exposing RDP that has not yet been patched and is vulnerable. So the bad guys already had the list. And once upon a time, you would launch a worm like the original Morris worm when you wanted to hide your identity from the internet. But now people take over other people's machines in order to perform proxy-based scanning. So you don't even need to hide anymore. So, yeah, I think he's right.
I would agree.
A bunch of great points.
Absolutely.
And
he's a smart guy.
Jason, we're going to talk about Mozilla and DOH versus COMCAST after our second break.
After this break from the sponsor of this episode of Security Now, which is FreshBooks. You know all about FreshBooks. We talk about FreshBooks here all the time because it is awesome. FreshBooks all-in-one small business invoicing and accounting solution helps you make running your business a breeze, keeps things easy for you. Because managing all of this stuff, managing the money that's coming in, going out, it can be a real pain in the butt if you don't have a solution like FreshBooks working for you. You can automate tasks like invoicing, organizing expenses, tracking your time, and following up with clients in just a few clicks. They let you run your business from anywhere using their mobile app, and they also integrate with many apps that you already use. Those integrations can be really powerful. FreshBooks is always finding new ways to make your experience even better. You now have the option to access FreshBooks using Google Sign-In. And Google Sign-In, Steve's talked a lot about Google Sign-In over the years. It comes with the option to add multi-factor authentication to your account to keep things even more secure. When you're talking about money, you want to keep things secure especially. This enhances security and limits or revokes the data access to third-party sites and apps. Basically what you're doing is you're hiring a security force to stand guard over your private information. Doesn't that sound tough? Simplicity and security, it really doesn't get any better than that. If you already use FreshBooks and have a Google account, you can log in using the Google Sign-In one-click process. If you're a small business using a Google account and want to sign up for FreshBooks, you're only one click away from making that happen. FreshBooks is used and trusted by small business owners in over 120 countries. With customer service via phone, email, and live chat, you're able to get a quick response to your questions in no time. And FreshBooks, it does everything. It does what it does really well, and it does it in kind of a delightful way, right? Like the interface, the experience, it's all just really easy to look at. It's not boring. Sometimes you want these experiences, especially when you're talking about money and running your business. You don't want it to be this like stale kind of, not enjoyable. And a lot of times it can be enjoyable. Believe me, I've used the apps that aren't enjoyable. You want something that's fresh and right. And it's right there in the name. FreshBooks is fresh. Make the running of your business easier and more efficient with FreshBooks. You can visit freshbooks.com/security now and enter security now in the How Did You Hear About Us section. You'll receive 30 days free when you do that. So you can check it out for yourself. That's freshbooks.com/security now. Enter security now to receive 30 days free. And we thank them for their support of this show. All right, circling back to DOH. Got a few pieces of news here. Lots of themes in today's show.
Yeah, we're a theme show. I did just want to. While you were delivering that, I was thinking that I just wanted to make sure that people understood what this means. That we now have a very reliable, non-crashing BlueKeep exploit, which will allow a reverse shell to be obtained by anyone on the internet who wants it for 700,000 plus Windows servers. I mean, that's huge.
Wow. Yeah.
That's and as Marcus says, we don't need a worm. Those machines are sitting there waiting to be commandeered and occupied by bad guys who then sit there and look around and see what they're connected to and what sort of goodies are on the LAN on the inside. So this is bad. Mm-hmm. And so Microsoft is warning people, as I said, I think because they have to, but it's been months now, and these systems are not getting themselves patched. They may be running crypto miners today. They're going to have bad guys, setting up shop and looking around to see what other mischief they can get up to shortly. It's just a matter of time. So, wow. And I had just realized there's another name for COMCAST. We should be calling them CONCAST.
CONCAST. you can't be the first to come up with that one, but it makes sense.
So Mozilla versus CONCAST. I was really glad to see Mozilla take the leaked slide deck, which we discussed last week, and push back hard with their own clarification and much more accurate letter to Congress. Their letter was signed by Marshall Irwin, who's the Senior Director of Trust and Security for Mozilla. I've got a link to it if anyone is interested, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I will share enough at the beginning of the letter so that our listeners get a sense for Mozilla's take and their position, and because they really raised some very good points. He wrote, "Dear chairs and ranking members," and this was an open letter addressed to Congress, "we are writing to express our concern about the privacy and security practices of Internet service providers, ISPs, particularly as they relate to the domain name services provided to American consumers. Our recent experience in rolling out DNS over HTTPS, DOH, an important privacy and security protection for consumers, has raised questions about how ISPs collect and use sensitive user data in their gatekeeper role over internet usage. With this in mind, a congressional examination of ISP practices may uncover valuable insights, educate the public, and help guide continuing efforts to draft consumer privacy legislation. During the past 2 years, Mozilla, in partnership with other industry stakeholders, has worked to develop, standardize, and deploy DOH, a critical security improvement to the underlying architecture of the Internet. A complementary effort to our work to fight ubiquitous web tracking, DOH will make it harder to spy on or tamper with users' browsing activity and will protect users from DNS providers, including ISPs, that can monetize personal data. We believe that such proactive measures have become necessary to protect users in light of the extensive record of ISP abuse of personal data, including the following incidents. And then they highlight 4 goodies. 1, providers sold the real-time location data of their mobile broadband customers to third parties without user knowledge or meaningful consent. In one particular case, an intermediary was found to be selling particularly sensitive GPS data, which can pinpoint the location of users within a building for over 5 years. 2, ISPs have repeatedly manipulated DNS to serve advertisements to consumers. COMCAST has previously injected ads to users connected to its public Wi-Fi hotspots, potentially creating new security vulnerabilities in websites. And last year, CenturyLink injected ads for its paid filtering software and disabled the internet access of its users until they acknowledged the offer. Verizon tracked the internet activity of over 100 million users without their consent through super cookies that could not be deleted or circumvented. This allowed Verizon to closely monitor the sites that users visited and catalog their interests without their knowledge. And finally, AT&T operated a program that required users to pay an extra $29 per month to opt out of the collection and monetization of their browsing history for targeted ads. While the company ended the program after public criticism, it has considered reviving it in the current deregulated environment. So they said, so unsurprisingly, our work on DOH has prompted a campaign to forestall these privacy and security protections, as demonstrated by the recent letter to Congress from major telecommunications associations. That letter contained a number of factual inaccuracies. These have been examined in detail by others, and as such will not be given an in-depth treatment here. Nonetheless, it is important to highlight the underlying premise of that letter. Telecommunications associations are explicitly arguing that ISPs need to be in a position to collect and monetize users' data. This is inconsistent with arguments made just 2 years ago regarding whether privacy rules were needed to govern ISP data use. With the 2017 repeal of the Broadband Privacy Order, a substantial gap in consumer privacy protection was created. That gap exists today. ISPs are people's gateway to the internet. That gateway can serve as a data collection point, providing ISPs with unique access to sensitive browsing information That is why broadband privacy rules would have required ISPs to get the clear consent to use and share their subscribers' information. However, those rules are no longer in place. And I'll conclude my quote of this, although their letter went on. Our approach with DOH attempts to close part of this regulatory gap through technology and strong protections for user privacy. Mozilla's policy establishes strict requirements for potential Firefox DNS resolvers, including requiring that data only be retained for as long as it is necessary to operate the resolver service, that data only be used for the purpose of operating that service, and that partners maintain a privacy notice specifically for the resolver that publicly attests to data collection and policies. Unfortunately, ISPs do not maintain privacy notices for their DNS servers. As a result, their policies are opaque to users. It is unclear what data is being retained, how it is being used, or who it is being shared with. So, bravo to Mozilla for pushing back on, the nonsense that we read in what COMCAST shared with Congress, and in this campaign that they are pushing for this kind of, just basically saying, we don't want this to happen, and we're not happy, is what it boils down to.
Now, lucky for Comcast, Comcast is actually a business that exists. So they're like, you can't even get us with that one, Steve.
Although, who would want that name? Who wants to call themselves Comcast? I don't know. That's not one I would go for.
Yeah, it's like, I'm trying to figure this out. It's like construction. It's construction solutions and completely unrelated. Anyways, I was very curious. I was like, this has got to be out there somehow.
So what I found somewhat to my surprise is that despite ISP associations' hissy fits, DOH will be rolling out for all major browsers. In the wake of all this DOH noise, ZDNet took it upon themselves to interview the product managers of all 6 major browsers. In alphabetical order, they are Brave, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Opera, and Vivaldi. And this was where I was a little surprised. Although I guess in retrospect I shouldn't have been, because so many of them are now Chromium-based. The good news is every single one of these top 6 browsers already has or soon will have DOH support. All of them. Brave, the Brave browser. Tom Lowenthal, product manager at Brave for privacy and security, told ZDNet, quote, "We absolutely want to implement it. Implementing DOH is far more than just the technical work, though. We need to decide on sensible and protective defaults for the vast majority of people who don't think about their DNS configuration, while making sure that we don't break things for the people and organizations who have carefully tuned their setup. Because Brave is built on top of Chromium, which of course, as we know, Chromium's open source browser code base, DOH support is available today. However, the Brave team has not yet tweaked the feature so that it works exactly the way they want to, so it's not enabled by default, but it's there. You can go to brave://flags/DNS-over-HTTPS and enable it right now if you're a Brave user, if you choose to. So bravo for Brave. Chrome, of course, as we know, does have it available. It's not yet enabled for everyone by default, since Google is currently running a limited experiment with a small number of users to see how DOH fares in a real-world test. And as we've noted, they're taking an adaptive approach, first attempting to honor the user's existing DNS provider to see whether it supports DOH and using it if possible. If not, then it follows a number of sort of heuristic rules of thumb to figure out what it should do. And again, in Chrome, you say Chrome : / the same flags / $DNS over HTTPS if you want to take control of it yourself and turn on DOH right now. Similarly with Edge, even Microsoft told ZDNet that they were supportive of DOH, but they couldn't share their exact plans. So, yeah, it sounds more like Microsoft. However, like Brave, and as we know, the soon-to-go mainstream in mid-January Chromium-based version of Edge already supports DOH, and the preview versions do. Same flag, Edge : / and then the rest, and you can turn DOH on in Edge right now. There are some additional tricks, command line switches and things, and I have links to a blog posting by one of the Edge developers, if anyone is a committed Edge user and is interested in getting going with DNS over HTTPS in Edge right now. And of course, as we know, Firefox was the first out of the gate with DOH, and as a consequence took some undeserved, in my opinion, arrows in their back for simply standardizing upon Cloudflare as their DOH provider. No one really took the time to understand how rigorously Mozilla had vetted Cloudflare. And many people who don't listen to this podcast might mistakenly believe that Cloudflare is just some other CDN. But anyone who has the class to erect a large wall of lava lamps and use the video image of those lava lamps to generate true random numbers definitely stands out as an innovator in my book. And of course, we know that Cloudflare did that. And they have met all of Mozilla's requirements that we noted above in their letter to Congress of really respecting user privacy and absolutely never using it for any sort of monetization scheme. And since Firefox is officially supporting it, you can turn it on in the standard browser UI. Opera is already rolled out DOH support. It is disabled by default for all users, but it can be enabled at any time in the stable release. And it works without going through any additional steps. They achieve the no additional steps in the same way that Firefox did, just by standardizing on Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 DOH resolver. And I'll note, though, that as Opera users probably know, Opera builds in a popular VPN. It and DOH, the VPN and DOH, are not compatible with each other. On the other hand, if you're using a VPN, you already have a privacy encrypting tunnel to route all of your browser's queries. So assuming that DNS goes through the VPN tunnel, I hadn't thought of that until just now. That would be worth checking to see whether it is whether your Opera's DNS with the VPN up is going through the tunnel or not. I don't know either way. In Opera, it's Opera : / flags / Opera-DOH in order to get to its configuration. Apple with Safari was completely mute. ZDNet was unable to obtain any reply from Apple about Safari one way or the other, but they are certainly privacy focused and user feature privacy focused. So I think once the dust settles on DOH, Safari will probably follow suit, and what will end up becoming probably the industry norm for browser-based DNS queries. And lastly, Vivaldi. It too is Chromium-based, so it also works like Chrome, and its flags are like the other Chromium-based browsers. Vivaldi : // flags / # DNS -- HTTPS. So, among many of COMCAST's misassertions was their focus upon Google. I guess Google makes a convenient soft target lately, but as we know, and as this list just demonstrates, despite COMCAST's assertions, it's not just Google, but the entire browser industry that is heading to DOH just as fast as development cycles and field trials will allow. So I think it is very clear ISPs ought to be reading the handwriting on the wall, which is that browsers are going to be privacy protecting their DNS because they can. And so I think what will happen is we'll have ISPs, I'm sure right now they're scurrying to bring up their own DOH support on their own DNS servers so that then they too will be able to be the DOH provider for browsers, which will return them to having an ability to see into their customers' DNS queries, at which point, hopefully, browsers will make it easy to say, I want to override my ISP's DNS. I want to go to a trusted provider that is not going to be monetizing me without my knowledge or permission. So I'll bet you that we see that before long. And again, there are many providers of DOH beyond Cloudflare. Mozilla just decided to settle on them because they were able to get the commitment from someone they trusted. And I certainly trust Cloudflare as well, and I think our listeners could too.
Absolutely. And is there much that the ISPs could really do? I mean, at this point, if all the browsers are implementing it, Comcast is just relying on their hopes that the government might somehow step in some way, shape, or form and prevent this.
It's true. There's nothing that they can do. They could block it, but that would be the end of life.
Mayhem. That's mayhem.
That would be that's not going to happen. So they can't see into it. I mean, it's worth noting that the DNS was a simple way to see what people were looking up, but people are still using the IP addresses they get from DNS to make the connections. So it's more work for an ISP to use the IP addresses and reverse look up those IP addresses to see who they're connecting to. And it's not also many hosted sites will share many domains across a single IP, so you can get some confusion. There is some ambiguity if you use IPs, but it's still something that ISPs will always have access to, unless their customers use a VPN, which then shields that too. But that seems unlikely. So ISPs really can't do anything. I think what we're going to see them do is, since Chrome is the majority browser, since it defers to using the pre-configured DNS resolver by default, ISPs are going to bring up their own DOH resolvers in order to once again capture this information, and sort of rendering this whole exercise moot. But users who can override and choose to override their built-in DNS, and maybe Firefox will continue to say, hey, we're using Cloudflare. We want to protect you from ISPs even after they bring up their own DOH services, which Firefox's strategy does, Google's strategy doesn't.
Right.
So that'll be interesting.
Yes.
And this little tidbit, this was just a throwaway, but
I know you're speaking to me with this one, by the way.
Oh, no kidding. Interesting.
Yeah.
I noted to our listeners when I saw this appear, we noted on this podcast when Microsoft decided to add the user's downloads directory to their handy little disk cleanup applet in Windows 10. And I specifically cautioned our listeners to be careful with that one, since on the one hand, many people are in the habit of forgetting their downloads folder and just allow it to grow without end. I happened to note the other day that Lori's is like, I don't know how many gigs of stuff. Everything she has ever downloaded is in that folder, which, I mean, I'm not kidding you. And I keep thinking, I keep looking at it thinking, oh, this hurts, but, I'm not going to mess with her machine. And as a consequence, it grows without end. And many of today's downloads are massive things that just sit there and squat on space. So I could see as a consequence of that, I could see the logic of having downloads in the disk cleanup applet. And in this era of multi-terabyte storage, many people have taken to using their downloads directory kind of more or less deliberately of an archive, a massive archive of everything they have ever downloaded. And they assume that everything will always be there. So Microsoft apparently discovered that too many people were simply going through and selecting all of the disk cleanup category checkboxes without looking, and were, as a consequence, permanently and inadvertently deleting their download archives. So that feature, which was first added into last year's ill-fated, and it then became infamous, October 2018 Windows 10 update, is now being removed. So in the future, if you want to delete stuff from your downloads directory, you'll need to do it yourself. And really, I think that does make the most sense. Disk cleanup should be for those obscure OS level things like in the list, DirectX shader cache, okay, delivery optimization files, whatever that is, system error memory dump files. Good, get rid of it. And Windows update cleanup. I looked as I was putting my notes together last night. I've got a gig of that on the machine that I was using last night. So good riddance. After I'm sure that I've updated and everything is stable and so forth, get rid of it. That crap accumulates that no one needs, sort of like OS belly button lint. So I can understand that being removed. And so what happened with you, Jason?
It was just bit? As I was reading through this, I was thinking about how I use, my downloads folder, or rather how I don't. It's
convenient to go back and get something sometimes.
I mean, yeah, it is. I don't know if it's the most secure approach, but yeah, I kind of compile things in my downloads folder. I don't think of anything that's in my downloads folder as permanent, but I do keep things there indefinitely. And it might be years down the line where I do a search for something, and what do you know? It's already in my downloads folder instead of me having to go out and download it again. So it comes in handy.
It's very much like when you go to Amazon and to buy something, and it says you purchased this on such and such, and I go, oh,
did I?
I got that around here.
Or you download something and then you realize the file that's been saved is a parentheses 2 or a parentheses 3, and you're like, I guess I already did this.
Yep.
But yeah, so I've never thought about how I use my downloads folder, whether it's a good or a bad idea. But yeah, it's like a growing collection. Every once in a while, I'll jump in there. I'll be like, I'll get creative or get a cleaning kind of bone in my body and clean it up a little bit. But I end up keeping things, but then I don't think about it as permanent storage anyway. So I don't know. If software on my computer suddenly just assumed that my downloads folder was a place for disk cleanup to automatically wipe away, I think I would be a little bit upset if I didn't realize that and suddenly it was empty. I'd be wondering what I was missing.
And I'm going to stop making fun of Lori. I just looked at mine. 3.576 gig.
Oh, really?
Okay,
interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Who's talking? 3.576. Yeah, thank goodness I don't have that checked on my machine.
But the question is, could you, without looking at the contents of your downloads folder, empty it right now? Would you be comfortable with that?
No, uncomfortable. Yes.
Uncomfortable.
There's definitely. I'm sure there's things. Now, what I told her I thought we should do for her, and now I'm thinking, okay, Gibson, take your own advice, is just grab the whole thing and drag it over to the Drobo, so it's there,
right?
And it's not on. Like right now, I'm making images of all that crap every single time I do an image of my whole system, which I have automated, and that's dumb.
Yeah.
So. Yeah,
it's true. Moving it over to some sort of archive or whatever. I tend to collect files on my desktop as well. At home.
I can't find my desktop. I can't even see it. It's just covered with little squares.
I don't go that far, but at some point it gets messy enough that I'm like, all right, I don't have the time to pull this stuff out now, but I do want to save it. So it's goes into a folder called My Desktop and the date, and then that goes into some archive somewhere, and then I keep it forever and never turn to it again.
Yes, Jason, and on the wall behind me, there are books. I have books.
What are those?
Like programming the VGA. And it actually
when was the last time you pulled out that book?
It was for SpinRite 6. I needed to do some VGA because I had to program it myself. But that's my point. Yeah.
They look really nice.
I'm looking at a book on CGI. Yeah. And, Microsoft AFC. Yeah, I could really do with some house cleaning here, but
that's okay. No, keep it. It helps your studio stay soundproof.
That's true. That's
true.
Help.
It's
not a hard surface so much.
That's right.
So one last little tidbit for our Linux and BSD users. The compression library included by default in Debian, Ubuntu, Gentoo, Arch Linux, FreeBSD, and NetBSD distros, and others, probably all of them, contains a vulnerability that can allow hackers to execute code on user machines. It's not an across the network vulnerability, so it's not like a BlueKeep thing. But last week, even though this thing's been known since June, last week, details about this major bug impacting essentially LibArchive, which is the archiving library that all of these OSs use, went public. But it was held embargoed until all the Linux and FreeBSD distros had rolled out updates containing patches for the version of LibArchive they had been shipping. So, of course, we know a decompressor is an interpreter because it interprets the tokenized, compressed representation of a file and re-expands it based on the tokens that it receives in the byte stream of the compressed contents. It is extremely difficult to find every possible flaw, and decompressors especially tend to be even more difficult than other interpreters because they must inherently operate with fewer constraints. They just sort of have to believe the data that they're being given. So this bug, which is being tracked as CVE 2019-18408, not surprisingly, allows an attacker to execute code on a user's machine if the user's machine attempts to decompress a deliberately malformed archive file. So exploit scenarios would involve the reception and decompression, like viewing something from email, receiving something in email, maybe downloading something from the net one way or another from a web or whatever. It's not something that allows a remote attacker to get you, but if you run something which has been deliberately created to exploit this flaw, on a Linux distro or free BSD or any BSD that has not been updated, you could get owned. So, as I mentioned, it was originally discovered and patched back in June. The vulnerability was identified by Google security researchers using some automated code testing tools when they call, and I'm not kidding, cluster fuzz and OSS fuzz. It was patched in LibArchive 3.4.0. I went over to libarchive.org and noted that 3.4.0 was released in June, on the 13th of June. So it has indeed been out there for a long time. Our takeaway for everyone is that now would be a good time, if you haven't for a while, to resynchronize your OSs with the latest repository updates. You may already have version 3.4.0. You might just do presumably you could do a man LibArchive and see what version of LibArchive you have on your system. As long as you're at 3.4.0, you're okay. If not, you probably want to update, because your system is vulnerable should you receive something. And it's not going to be a widespread attack. It's not going to be a spray. There are no known exploits in the wild, though they would likely be targeted. And so, you don't want to be a victim of that kind of targeting. So just make sure you have version 3.4.0, which, as I said, has been around for a year. I mean, since June 13th. So, you may well already have it. And Jason?
Yes, sir.
Our final break, and then we're going to look at credential delegation, yet another approach for solving the problem of certificate revocation within a more limited scope. Very cool. This is an emerging IETF standard, and so we'll do a little bit of a deep dive.
All right, we got a deep dive coming up on credential delegation. First, let's take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode of Security Now, and that is Thinkst Canary. Two things all companies should know when it comes to data breaches. Hear about data breaches all the time, especially on this show. One, hackers take the path of least resistance. What would that be? That's your staff. Sometimes it's just way easier to go with the human approach than it is to go with the technology behind. And two, it takes on average 191 days for a company to even realize that there's been a data breach. Companies spend millions of dollars on IT security, but still don't know when they were compromised. Take Marriott Hotels, for example. 500 million guests were affected by their breach over a 4-year period. So you can make your company's reputation a priority with Thinkst Canary. You sprinkle a few canaries on your network, you'll get a single high-quality alert when it matters. No 4-year periods like the Marriott Hotels example. Everyone spoke about honeypots in the early 2000s, but Thinkst has made them trivial to deploy with zero administration overhead. Canaries can be set up in under 4 minutes, and within minutes of configuration, your canary will look identical to a router, a switch, a NAS server, a Linux box, or a Windows server. Attackers will not be able to tell the difference. The company behind Canary has been in the security game for nearly 2 decades. They've trained companies, militaries, even governments on how to break into networks, and they've used that experience to build Canary. Thinkst Canaries don't look vulnerable on your network. They look valuable. They're enticing even. You can put fake files on them or even enroll them in Active Directory. The system's amazingly well priced. Instead of a massive upfront cost, canaries are licensed annually. So if your birds break during the year, Thinkst will simply replace them. The pricing allows you to easily try a few and then easily scale up as you want and as you need to. Some small shops have 2 canaries. Some large banks have hundreds of them. You can kind of see how you can scale depending on the size of your organization. Thinkst Canaries are deployed all over the world, literally on all 7 continents. Some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley run them and love them. and we're confident that you will as well. So don't end up on this year's list of top 10 data breaches. That's a list you don't want to be on. Visit canary.tools/twit. And for just $7,500, that's $7,500 per year, you get 5 canaries, your own hosted console, upgrades, support, and maintenance for a full year. And we have a special offer for our audience if you use code TWIT in the How Did You Hear About Us box to get 10% off the price for life. That's use the code TWIT in the How Did You Hear About Us box, and you'll get 10% off of that price for life. We're sure you're going to love Thanks Canary, but if you're not happy, you can always return your canaries with their 2-month money-back guarantee for a full refund. That's canary.tools/twit, and do make sure to enter the code TWIT in the How Did You Hear About Us box, and we thanks to Canary for their support of Security Now. And now a deep dive on credential delegation. Tell us what this is all about.
As we know, web servers prove the domains they control by providing a certificate which has been previously signed by a certificate authority whom the client knows and trusts. That certificate will contain an enumeration of one or more internet domains and or IP addresses and the server's previously assigned public key. During the TLS handshake, the client challenges the server with a random nonce, which the server must sign using its matching secret private key. The client uses the public key in the signed certificate authority certificate to verify the server signature of its message containing the nonce. And if the signature verifies, the client can then be sure of one thing, that the server is indeed currently in possession of the private key that matches the public key in the certificate that was signed by the trusted certificate authority. So that's how our certificate system works today. But what if the server's private key is ever stolen? That's, as we've often talked about it, that's the Achilles heel of this system. And it's such a significant and intractable problem for our industry that I and this podcast have spent a great deal of time through the years exploring the problem and sharing the problem and its various solutions with our listeners. And in terms of the scope of the problem, it's one thing for me to keep GRC's private key secret. I have one 1U high rack-mounted server that's as well shielded from external network penetration as I've been able to make it. That physical server is in a locked rack to which only I and Level 3 have access. As I mentioned, Level 3's facility is a bunker. Neither Sue nor Greg have ever had any reason to have access. So, I'm the only one who knows it, who has access to it. That server is in a locked, heavily monitored, and guarded, super secure facility. And there are no other copies of that private key anywhere in the world. So it's about as secure as I can imagine. But consider this situation for Facebook or Cloudflare or Google or any other massive internet provider. They have thousands of servers spread across the globe in hundreds of data centers. And they have hundreds of thousands of employees. And sure, many fewer than all their employees need to have access or do have access to those servers, but certainly still a great many. We recently heard that Twitter had discovered a couple of spies in their midst. So that's a problem. And so too is keeping an absolute secret, which is what that private key must be kept, an absolute secret across thousands of networked servers around the world. Mistakes happen. We cover them often on this podcast. This is it could be called security mistakes as well as security now. And so we know that robust security is inherently always a best effort. We do the best we make the best effort we can to eliminate all the bugs in our software. Where when they are revealed, we fix them, hopefully as quickly as we can, to minimize the damage. So the point is that resiliency in the face of a breach, which is to say recovering gracefully and quickly, is often the best we can do. So when a server's private key escapes through whatever means and for whatever reason, the best thing that can be done is to immediately revoke its authority to represent the property for which it was signed, so that it cannot be used to impersonate any of those properties moving forward. All of our longtime listeners to this podcast will already know about revocation. This process of revoking a certificate's authority. Revocation's utter failure and total implementation collapse has been one of my personal crusades and hobby horses for years. Everyone will recall that I invested a great deal of time and trouble to demonstrate just how utterly broken, non-existent really, Google's Chrome browser's CRL set revocation handling has always been. I went so far as to deliberately create a revoked certificate and set it up on a revoked site to demonstrate that Chrome would honor it on every platform, despite the fact that it was clearly revoked and should never be honored. What did Google do? They added a special case exception for that particular revoked certificate. So I changed the certificate, and they gave up because they realized I would just change the certificate again. The point is, Chrome has always been broken. They don't have revocation. Now, since all of the certificates that are signed, as we know, have an expiration of 2 to 3 years for public domain TLS certificates, they will eventually take themselves out of service by self-expiring. So it's only the still valid by date certificates, which we wish were no longer honored, that we need to somehow suppress. So the first solution, the first of many bad solutions, was CRLs, certificate revocation lists. Certificate authorities were supposed to publish a list of all the certificates they had issued which had been revoked but were otherwise still valid. And then anyone relying upon a certificate authority's certificate was supposed to check that list before trusting the certificate. But as it turned out in practice, this didn't work very well. Certificate authorities were slow to update their lists when they even bothered to at all. Those lists would become quite long and thus took a while to download. So browsers didn't want to be doing that all the time. And so the relying clients that were relying upon the certificates weren't much better about pulling and checking the lists. So even when things were being checked, which wasn't really that often, so much so that it's just kind of broken completely, even in the best case, there would be a significant gap from the time somebody would, a CA would revoke a certificate and it would actually be known to be revoked, if ever. So the next thing that we came up with was OCSP, stands for Online Certificate Status Protocol. That was a nice solution that was intended to close this large window of time between a certificate's revocation and a client's awareness of that having happened. But that system too has flaws that we've discussed in the past. Checking the status of every TLS certificate takes additional time that no one wants to spend. So like you go to a site, you obtain a certificate from the browser. Now the browser has to look at the certificate, find in the certificate's metadata the URL of that certificate, the issuing certificate authority's OCSP server, make a connection to the OCSP server, querying it with the OCSP protocol for the updated status of the certificate that is just received. The reason you do this is that it might be a bad guy who has sent you the certificate. It has since been revoked, but the certificate itself hasn't expired because it could last 3 years. And so this gives you a real-time means of getting the current revoked status of the certificate. But that's an extra connection. Some CAs, OCSP servers, certainly in the beginning, were slow. Sometimes they never replied. They were offline. And so then if the browser doesn't get an affirmative okay, what does it do? Well, it's going to either fail open or closed. That is, it's either going to fail and trust if it can't get an affirmative denial, or it's going to fail closed and refuse a connection, but the certificate might be valid, it just can't verify that it's valid. So if the browser chooses to fail in the trusting direction, that means that a bad guy can block the OCSP query. I mean, presumably if a bad guy is in a position to spoof a remote server anyway, that sort of suggests they're in the position to intercept the user's traffic. And so they could block the query to the OCSP server, knowing that the browser will fail in the trusty fashion, and then the bad guy wins. So OCSP has its problems. For all these reasons, the one correct and perfect solution is OCSP stapling. And when we last looked, Nginx had some flaky behavior. With OCSP stapling, I love this solution because now what happens is the server which is sending the certificate staples a recent OCSP assertion to their certificate and provides it to the client. The client looks at the certificate, says, oh, look, I have the OCSP assertion, which is fresh. That is, maybe as fresh as a few hours old, which has been signed by the certificate authority. So what that does is it shifts the burden of providing a fresh assertion onto the site that you're already connecting to, getting the certificate from. And that makes a lot of sense. The server periodically goes out and updates its its own OCSP assertion, which it sends out with all the certificates. And for example, GRC does that. So my sense is, moving forward, once this is well supported by all the servers across the net, it really represents a good solution. But we're still not quite there, and there are some use cases that this doesn't fit perfectly. For example, the one that we're about to address here. Lastly, though, there's something that's happened since. If the web server is going to be taking the trouble to periodically obtain a fresh assertion of its certificate's validity from its certificate authority, why not just allow the server to obtain a completely new and fresh certificate with a short lifespan? And that, of course, is one of the features of the industry's latest innovation with the so-called ACME protocol, ACME, which stands for Automated Certificate Management Environment. As we know, ACME first appeared with the Let's Encrypt movement, and they were followed by other CAs, including now my favorite one, DigiCert, that also offers ACME-based certificates. ACME gives us a sort of workable compromise. But there's a frightening trade-off between safety and failure. Let's Encrypt's certificates are valid for 90 days. So that's a lot better, which is to say they have an expiration date, which is when the certificate is issued, no further than 90 days in the future. The idea being that since it's an automated system, it's easy to update the certificate before then. But still, that's 3 months. So it's a lot better than 3 years of validity, but it's still a large open window. If a recently issued Let's Encrypt certificate were to be compromised, that compromised certificate will have an expiration date nearly 90 days away. So during that period of time, a great deal of damage can be done. If we were to automate the issuance of very short duration certs, like hours instead of months, then the good side is, the upside is that if one of those were to be leaked, it's a very low value. It's going to die, almost before the bad guy is able to get set up and ready and try to use it. But then with very short duration certificates, we face the possibility of the dynamically issuing certificate authority suffering any sort of problem that could interfere with our refresh. They might be DDoSed or suffer a network outage of some sort, during which all of everybody's short duration certs would expire and could not be replaced, which would lead to a catastrophic loss of service. So that's no good either. The problem to this, the solution to this problem, in a new in-the-works system, formerly known as delegated credentials for TLS. It's been quietly in the works for the past 3 years by Facebook and Cloudflare, who have this problem, and Mozilla, who is over on the client side. Cisco also had some involvement, and this has just surfaced. Delegated credentials for TLS. Now, because it requires support from our browsing clients, if you think about it, that's the one thing that Let's Encrypt doesn't require. Let's Encrypt it needed to be trusted in the beginning. So as we know, they were using cross-signed certificates. So I think it was Global Trust or somebody was signing, or Global Sign, somebody was signing their certs in the beginning until the Let's Encrypt route was readily available in all browser clients, as it is now. The point is that none of those earlier solutions required client-side support. This does. This is an evolution of TLS version 1.3 to add an extension to the protocol, which does need awareness in the client. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, Firefox has it now, and our listeners can play with this immediately. So, because it requires web browsing client support, it's going to take some time to become fully deployed. But it does offer a new and very useful tool that would be practical when dealing with these high-risk scenarios involving many thousands of servers that all need to keep a secret. It wouldn't be of any use to me, for example, where I've got one server with one cert that is, locked away as securely as I've been able to make it. But in the case of Facebook or Cloudflare, where they've got to have certificates spread around in order to quickly terminate TLS connections, yet they're at risk of that facility being compromised or a server being compromised in any way, they need a way of offering short duration attestations, or in this case, delegations of their longer lived credentials. And that's what this system provides. We already have the well-established concept of a certificate hierarchy, where the CA signs typically now an intermediate CA certificate, just so that their grand master can be locked away in deep freeze. Typically an intermediate certificate is there. It then signs the certificate which is being presented to clients by the web server. So, and the idea is that this is a hierarchy because each certificate is signed by the one above it. What this new delegated credentials extension to TLS 1.3 offers for the first time ever is the ability for the end certificate to delegate short duration, to delegate its credentials to a short duration certificate. That is essentially the likes of Facebook and Cloudflare would be able to sign this credential delegation themselves and include in that the public key for a short-lived private key. The browser would use the public key in that credential rather than the public key in the parent credential, which the delegated credential using server would no longer honor. It wouldn't even have the matching private key. It only is able to have the public key. It would sign that credential and offer it to the server. So, okay, so let me step back a little bit. The web browser client needs to be updated. Firefox is. When you enable its credential delegation, all of its connections have this delegated credential acknowledgement added to the client hello packet, which is the first thing that goes off to the remote web server as it's doing its TLS handshake. That tells the server that the client is up to speed and is aware of the operation of credential delegation, so that the server that it's connected to does not have the master credential. It does not have the private key which the ultimate certificate authority issued. Instead, it has a short-lived certificate which it received from a master server at Facebook or Cloudflare. So it's sort of like a CA within the organization which is able to delegate its credential for a short period of time without ever giving out its private key. That is, that private key never leaves headquarters. Only the short-lived credentials which are signed by it leave, and they contain a similarly short-lived private key. So the credential contains a public key which the browser will use for it to complete its handshake, an expiration date for this credential, and the signature of the delegated credentials which were signed by the server's certificate which never leaves headquarters. So this reuses the proven strength and integrity of the existing certificate hierarchy by allowing content providers themselves to provide the last link in the certificate chain for the issuance of these short duration TLS certificates. And there are a couple interesting little twists here. First of all, there is no provision for revocation. They're not even trying anymore to revoke. There's no provision for the revocation of these delegated credentials. On the other hand, they are hard limited to a maximum validity duration of 7 days. And any client must, as part of the protocol, must and will refuse any delegated credential that had a life longer than 7 days. So when the client gets it, you know how all certificates have a not valid before and not valid after dates. You know, a date of first valid and last valid. If that is any wider than 7 days, the certificate is deemed invalid. So no one will bother issuing those because no clients will accept them. And so that means that essentially we've come up with a solution, and who knows, maybe it's not like 7 days is what these guys will actually choose. It's that they can. That is, the spec says they could be up to 7 days. It may very well be once the system is up and running and is proven that they'll and like they've got backups for their master, their grandmaster, and so forth. They may choose to set them for 4 hours. I mean, they can be whatever they want them to be up to 7 days. So this is really cool because it solves the problem of the CA being offline. That is the problem that Let's Encrypt might have of relying upon an external party over whose network you have no control by getting long-lived certificates from them and then keeping it within the family, keeping it within your own local network, essentially, with a network you do have control of, where a single master server, which keeps the master key for one of these major content providers, is then able to reissue its own very short-lived delegations so that it's never exposing its master private key. It's only exposing essentially a working key good for, however long the provider chooses to have it be true for. So this is already in Firefox. I think, and it is a forthcoming IETF standard. Been well designed. I've got links to the standard in the show notes, and something our users can try. If you are a Firefox user or who have access to Firefox and you're curious, go to about:config. We know that the result is an overwhelming list of tweaks and options and settings. So you want to use the search bar and just put in delegated. That's probably, or delegate. That's enough. I put in DELE and it whittled it down to about 6 different hits. But if you put in delegated, you get 1. You will see there Firefox's support right now for this credential delegation. Mine was turned off, so I double-clicked it to flip it to true to turn it on. Then I went to FB, as in Facebook, fbdelegatedcredentials.com. That's a nice little test site which anyone can use. www.fbdelegatedcredentials.com. And if everything works, you'll just see a notice that acknowledges that the server and your browser have just successfully negotiated a TLS version 1.3 connection successfully using delegated credentials. So, as I said, this doesn't make sense for single server scenarios where you already only have your key in one place. It's not really buying you something. I mean, I guess I could see you might put the key somewhere else and have that like even more secure, and have your server reach out for for an updated delegated credential for it to then resend to all of the clients connecting to it for some period of time. Yeah, maybe, but boy, this is a beautiful solution for what we've seen evolve on our globe, which is these massive content providers that are globe spanning, that want to have local points of presence for their service offerings in data centers not far away from their customers. Yet they've got this management problem of it being a catastrophe to be using certificates with multi-year expirations against the danger of that one of those private keys, any one of them anywhere, getting loose, and the revocation system being so broken that it might as well not even, no one should have bothered with it in the first place, which actually comically is the path that Chrome took. Was like, well, it's broken, so we're not going to bother. It's like, well, okay, but it has been useful. Anyway, a very cool solution, and now all of our listeners understand it.
So, and then as you spelled out, Firefox already has support. You can flag that on. Chrome going to circle back around on this, and
no question,
It's just a matter of when.
And as a consequence of the fact that it's pretty much Firefox and Chromium, what it means is that as soon as the Chromium code gets it, all the other browsers get it.
Yeah, it's true.
Edge, Opera, Brave, and I'm sure that, Safari will do it. I mean, so, and of course you do need a fallback for when a client doesn't support that, then it just doesn't know about delegated credentials. It'll go, what the heck? So there will be a phasing over time, but here we are. I mean, it's not difficult for it to support it. It's a matter of the client adding that to its client hello handshake. Firefox is all open source too. So, I'm sure and Firefox and Mozilla, the Chromium guys and Mozilla are always sharing stuff. So, I mean, it's probably already in the works. If it's not, in some early build of Chrome, if it's not already there, I don't know for sure either way, but it's as simple as a little bit of logic to add the I know about delegation flag on the client hello packet, and then when you receive the response, you look in a different place. You don't use the public key that is in the certificate that you received. It will not be honored. You use the public key which is in the delegated credential, which is signed by the public key of the master public key, and so that's the one. So you use that public key to verify the validity of the delegated credential. So again, it's hard to describe in language. I hope I've done so for our listeners, but basically a relatively simple change for our clients. The good news is in the industry, we really only have three now: Firefox, Safari, and Chromium, which is an umbrella for all of the others. And then we're going to have this pretty quickly. And as soon as it's ubiquitously present, then Firefox and Facebook, Facebook and Cloudflare and the others will be able to withdraw their private keys from all of their end node servers and instead start having them only serve very short-term credentials. And what it really means is that they're not going to be attacked because they won't have a credential worth attacking.
Right.
So, so it's it also lowers the pressure on getting one of those prized private keys out of one of those servers. It's a very cool, next generation change. So bravo to those guys who put this together.
Yeah, it's definitely progressive. Love it. And someone in chat, there was a little bit of confusion. It's fbdelegatedcredentials.com, not fb.delegatedcredentials. So all one word.
Yes.
And that should take you
One
there and check
long,
it out.
Yes, good. Thank you.
Your Facebook browser.
FBDelegratedCredentials.com.
Right on. Interesting stuff. That's something to look forward to. And yeah, great show, Steve.
Well, our listeners have been wanting a little something meaty for a while, so I figured, okay, we'll wind them around that one.
Love it. Also, just a totally unrelated aside, I was noticing as we're reaching the end of that doc, I was like looking at your squirrel logo and then also on your mic, and just kind of, that's a really brilliant logo. I have to say I really like it a lot, because the longer I look at it, the more I realize what was probably obvious to so many people, how the tail, yes, looks like a lock, but also is in the shape of an S for squirrel. And I don't know, whoever did your logo design for squirrel is doing a really great job.
It was a really gifted, very temperamental Spaniard who I used the logosauce.com site, which is I've used them a number of times. They're a great site, but boy, this guy, he just, I used the word hissy fit earlier, and I, he would get all bent out of shape and go away, and he was worried that other people were stealing his ideas, and because I was like trying to move the whole community in the right direction. And anyway, I ended up paying him for it, and I'm very happy for it. And of course, I put it in the public domain. It's everyone's to use who is doing squirrel things. But anyway, thank you. I'm glad you like it. I'm just so pleased with it.
It was just in that moment that I realized, like, I've always seen the lock and the tail, but it was that moment that I realized, wait a minute, it's also an S. That works for Steve. That works for squirrel. This is amazing. And of course, speaking of squirrel, we do have the squirrel event coming up November 30th. It's just a couple of weekends away. Saturday, November 30th, 2:15 p.m. Pacific is when that's going to take place. I'm sure that's going to be live streamed, of course, twit.tv/live if you can't be here in studio. If you can be here at studio, I'm super not aware whether there are even seats left at this point, but tickets at twit.tv. If you know for certain that you can make it, email tickets at twit.tv, so you're not taking that opportunity from someone else who could possibly do it, and let them know. Inquire within, and they'll let you know if there's still space. I have not heard this past week whether that has filled up entirely or not, but that's Saturday, November 30th, 2:15 p.m. Pacific, if you want to hear Steve here at the studio talking all about squirrel and everything related. So looking forward to that. Go to grc.com for everything that Steve is doing. SpinRide, of course, the hard drive recovery and maintenance tool that's amazing, and you can get your copy there. Information about Squirrel if you want to do some reading about that and research about that. Audio and video of this show can be found there. There you go. There's SpinRide. Shields up. Audio and video of this show can be found there, as well as transcripts of this show. If you rely on transcripts, you can find it only at grc.com. And then if you go to our site, it's twit.tv/SN. There you're going to see Leo in the banner image, who will be back on this show next week. But you'll also find audio and video of all of the episodes, all the ways to subscribe, all the information that you need, just a click away by going to twit.tv/SN. We record this show every Tuesday live at 1:30 p.m. Pacific, 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And I checked the UTC today. It's 21:30 UTC now after the time change here in the U.S. So if you want to watch us live, you can. twit.tv/live, and you can participate in the chat room like so many folks today. We're chatting about the topics that Steve was talking about today. Steve, excellent job, and I've really enjoyed doing the show with you this past month.
Jason,
thank you so much for having me along.
Great 4 episodes in a past month, and next time Leo wanders off to somewhere, I hope you'll come back for us.
Absolutely. Anytime, I'm happy to do it. I love hanging out with you. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode, watching or listening to this episode of Security Now with Steve Gibson. We'll see you all next week with Leo back in the chair. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Security Now.